It's a strange thought, isn't it? How a totally harmless object, just a simple fantasy, could actually be the trigger for a person's complete and utter psychological collapse. Well, today, we're going to pull back the curtain on a story where an obsession with a doll leads to something far, far darker than child's play.
Right, let's just get straight to it, because this is the central mystery we're trying to solve here. How does a regular guy, someone with no big, dramatic trauma in his past, end up murdering the woman he's supposed to marry? This isn't your typical story about deep, dark secrets. Nope. It's something way more subtle and honestly, maybe a little more scary. So let's piece this psychological puzzle together, shall we?
Okay, so before we can figure out the why, we have to get a really clear picture of the what. Our investigation starts with the facts of the case, and for that, we're diving into Sadeq Hedayat's surrealist masterpiece, The Doll Behind the Curtain.
So let's just trace this path to disaster, because it really does unfold like a tragic domino effect. It all starts out simply enough. You've got Mehrdād, a totally normal student, who gets obsessed with a mannequin in a shop window. To him, it's this perfect, silent, beautiful thing. And this obsession, which seems harmless, starts everything. He goes back home, and he completely neglects his actual fiancée for this doll. So in this desperate attempt to get him back, she decides to imitate the doll. And that act, the one that was meant to bring them closer, is the very thing that shatters his fantasy world and leads to that final, tragic showdown.
So we've got the story down, but right away we hit a major roadblock. You know, usually when you see a psychological breakdown this severe, you start digging for some big early trauma. But with this case, well, that whole script just gets thrown right out the window.
And here is where it gets really, really puzzling. The story is super clear about this. Mehrdād's background? It's stable. There are no hidden scars, no deep psychological wounds that explain what he does. For all intents and purposes, he's a normal guy living a pretty decent life. So, where in the world did that violence come from?
Which, of course, brings us right back to our big question. If we can't blame old wounds, then what are we even looking for? What kind of psychological pressure can build up so fast and so intensely that it can literally shatter someone's reality? To answer that, we're going to need a whole new set of tools.
And those tools come from a framework called the Brain Kinematics Model. Now, I know it sounds a little unconventional, but it gives us this incredibly powerful lens to see the invisible psychological forces that were at play here.
Don't worry about the fancy name. All you really need to know is that this model looks at psychology a bit like physics. It helps us map out the unseen emotional pressures in a relationship. You know, how one person's choices can build up this invisible stress on someone else, creating a dangerous imbalance.
Now this is what I find so interesting, because it frames the entire conflict perfectly. On one side, you have Mehrdād, who chooses the fancy life. He's all in on the doll because it's easy, it asks for nothing, there's no messy emotional stuff, it makes him feel balanced. But that balance is incredibly fragile. On the other side, you've got his fiancée, Derek Shonday. She lives in the focused life, the real world, with all its give and take and hard work. It's tougher, for sure, but it builds real strength. Their entire tragedy comes from this fundamental clash of worlds.
So, using this idea of a fancy versus a focused life, we can basically perform a psychological autopsy. We can trace the exact mechanics of how these two very different paths collided and led to absolute disaster.
Let's walk through this table, because it shows the breakdown step by step. In the beginning, the early phase, they're fine. It's a normal relationship. But then comes the fantasy phase. When Mehrdād retreats to his doll, his own emotional strain goes down. The doll asks nothing of him. But at the exact same time, her strain just skyrockets from being neglected. Then, in the imitation phase, she desperately tries to become the doll to win him back, but that just pushes her own mind past its breaking point and completely confuses him. And it all leads to that final, awful reveal where his fragile fantasy just implodes and she becomes the tragic victim of its collapse.
And this right here brings us to the solution to our big puzzle. See, we were all looking for long-term strains, the kind that come from childhood and fester for years, but that was the wrong place to look entirely. Mehrdād's problem was a short-term strain. It was a brand new obsession that was incredibly powerful, but also incredibly fragile. It wasn't some deep-rooted tree, it was more like a house of cards, just waiting for the slightest touch of reality to come crashing down.
So, to put it simply, this wasn't an old wound finally breaking open. It was a new fantasy completely imploding under the very first real pressure it ever faced.
You know, what makes this story so powerful is that it's not just some weird one-off piece of fiction. This psychological pattern, the dangerous pull of a perfect fantasy over a messy reality, that's a timeless, universal human theme.
And this whole idea is a warning that we see again and again in literature. When a comfortable fancy takes the place of an engaged focus, the real danger isn't coming from our past, it's coming from the fragility of the very fantasy we built to protect ourselves.
And get this, Hedayat's story has a literary twin that was written more than 100 years earlier, E.T.A. Hoffmann's The Sandman. The plot is almost identical. A student falls for a mechanical doll, neglects his real fiancée, and it all ends in madness. It's this recurring theme you see in surrealist literature, the mannequin as a doorway to unreality, a fantasy that ends up eating its creator alive.
All right, let's bring all these threads together for our final verdict on this case. What's the ultimate lesson here? The main takeaway from this whole investigation into the doll behind the curtain.
Here it is, the single most important insight we can get from this. We're so conditioned to look into someone's distant past for the causes of a psychological disaster. We're always searching for those deep, old traumas that we think define a person's life.
But this story shows us there's another path to ruin. It highlights the incredible danger of the fancy life, that fake balance we create when we hide away in these easy, idealized worlds. These fantasies, they feel safe, right? But their foundations are built on sand, and they are just waiting to collapse, suddenly and violently, the moment the real world comes knocking.
And this leaves us with a final and pretty challenging question for ourselves. The story of Mehrdād and his doll, that isn't just some surrealist tale from the 1930s. It's a warning about a very human impulse. It forces us to ask, what comfortable, low-effort fantasies are we substituting for the messy, demanding work of real life? And maybe more importantly, are we absolutely sure their foundations are strong enough to hold?